From the last BMF championship being a one-time thing fought 5 years ago, to bringing the title back because the UFC 291 matchup is way too iconic. This is the real reason Dana White is bringing back the BMF belt for Poirier versus Gaethje 2. Let's take a trip down the BMF memory lane first. The BMF belt, which literally stands for the baddest was something the UFC cooked up back in 2019. They introduced it at their 500th event in Madison Square Garden, and it was going to be awarded to the winner of the epic fight between Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz at UFC 244, and man, did they put on a show. From the get-go, Masvidal was on fire, and he landed a wicked elbow followed by a sneaky head kick right in the first round that sent Diaz crashing to the canvas. That flurry busted Diaz open around his right eye and did some serious damage. But even with a strong start, Jorge wasn't keen on grappling with Diaz. He played it safe, sticking to the stand-up game and outworking Nate with his striking. Nate tried to turn up the heat, but Jorge managed to slip away and reset the action. But just when things were heating up, a doctor stepped in and stopped Jorge's punishment, which was a total letdown to everyone watching that night. Now, Diaz had seen worse cuts in his career. But the doc took a quick look at him between the rounds and waved off the fight, with a TKO stoppage at minute 5 of the third round, and Jorge wasn't satisfied with the premature ending. He wanted to settle things fair and square, and although he accepted the specially made BMF belt and owned that title ever since, Jorge made it clear that he wanted a rematch. And Diaz, well, he wasn't backing down either. But that rematch never happened, and made a lot of people wonder, what even was the point of the BMF belt? The whole thing was all about finding out who's the toughest guy in the UFC, and Diaz, the man himself, coined the term during an interview. And boy did that one-liner catch fire. It all started after Nate Diaz beat Anthony Pettis at UFC 241, and right there in the octagon, he called out Jorge Masvidal, saying there ain't no gangsters left in the game except for the two of them, and in his post-fight press conference, Diaz called himself the baddest in the UFC. And that's when things got interesting because Dana White loved the idea so much that he decided to make it happen. During the meeting to plan the fight, he said it'd be cool to have Nate fight Masvidal, and even created the special BMF belt just for that one fight, all because the matchup was so popular. Dana White said that the BMF belt was the most expensive one in the UFC, costing $50,000, and I know what you're thinking. All that for one belt? Yeah, Dana made it crystal clear that it'd only be fought once. And how did he do that? Well, the back of the belt had a 1/1 stamped on it just to drive the point home, and Jorge has held that BMF title since. The BMF championship was a one-time moment, and that's all it was meant to be for Jorge. Fast forward to UFC 272, and Masvidal couldn't seal the deal in the main event, where he went up against Colby Covington and threw down for 25 minutes straight. But when the fight was over, Jorge only managed to land 67 strikes out of 90 total, and fans couldn't help but notice that ever since his epic flying knee knockout of Ben Askren, things weren't going so smoothly for Jorge. He lost 3 fights in a row and 5 out of his last 8 bouts, leading up to UFC 272. He even had 2 shots at the welterweight title against Kamaru Usman at UFC 251 and UFC 261, but he couldn't make it happen. And that last fight, man, it ended with a killer knockout. He was then set to fight Gilbert Burns in the co-main event at UFC 287, and during the pre-fight press conference, Jorge had mentioned putting the BMF belt on the line, but he wanted to rack up some victories first. And then, after a one-sided beatdown from Burns, Masvidal announced his retirement. Usually, he would get those money fights, facing tough opponents and all, but with no recent wins to show for it, things weren't looking too good for Jorge. That was his 4th consecutive loss, and that win over Nate Diaz was the peak of his career, because he never managed to win another fight or snatch another championship in the UFC. So when you really think about it, that BMF belt didn't really mean much because Jorge's career didn't exactly go well, even after that shiny belt around his waist. But Dana's still bringing the title back for the iconic showdown between Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje 2 at UFC 291. The UFC made the announcement in a press release, letting everyone know that Gaethje and Poirier would be battling it out for the vacant BMF title. Because the previous title holder, Jorge, has retired now, making Poirier and Gaethje the first people to have a shot at the BMF title since 2019. Now let's rewind a bit and revisit when Poirier and Gaethje first met each other, back in 2018 at a UFC on Fox event. Poirier was riding high on a third-round submission win over Anthony Pettis when he stepped into the octagon for the first showdown against Gaethje. Justin himself was looking to bounce back from his first career loss, which was a knockout by Eddie Alvarez at UFC 218. But even with that setback, Gaethje was still fired up and ready to go to war just 4 months later. But Poirier eventually secured a TKO victory in the 4th round, and it was the last time Gaethje suffered a knockout defeat. It was one hell of a battle, with Poirier's TKO making it one of the most violent fights of 2018. Dustin said he loved every moment of it and wanted to do it again, and fast forward 5 years, the UFC's granted his wish. And this time, he has the BMF title on the line. After the match was officially confirmed, Gaethje made it clear that he won't be making the same mistakes again. He said he's grown for sure, and Dustin agrees, saying it'll be a tougher battle this time. But he's still sure that the outcome will be the same as their first match. The fight's gonna have a huge impact in the lightweight division, and whoever comes out on top will be a lot closer to earning a shot at the title. It's gonna go down on July 29th, 2023, and the BMF Championship's set to be the 5-round main event of the card. And I know what you're thinking, the whole BMF thing was just a one-time fight. So why's Dana bringing it back at all? I'll give you a little hint. It's all about that green paper. Money talks, and Dana White loves himself some cash. Here's the deal. The BMF belt was all just a clever marketing trick. It was all about hyping up the fight and getting people pumped. The UFC wanted to promote the event like crazy to boost their sales, and the BMF belt was the perfect way to do it. When you slap that BMF belt on the line, it adds a whole new level of excitement to the fight. And when people get excited, they're gonna pay more to watch the event on pay-per-view. But not everyone was on board with this whole BMF belt idea. Some fans saw through Dana's tricks and knew that it was just a fake title because, after all, the BMF belt was a one-time thing, and it didn't hold the same weight as the other UFC titles. But hey, sometimes you gotta spice things up, right? In the end, the BMF still got people talking because it was a cool title to have, and it definitely made some cash flow into the UFC's pockets, so why wouldn't Dana bring it back? He loves the hype train surrounding it, because the BMF belts become a symbol of being the coolest guy in the UFC, and fighters like Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington said they would love to have a shot at it. What's crazier is that Jorge doesn't even know someone else is stealing his title. Yep, White admitted he hasn't even told Masvidal about it. According to Dana, the decision to bring back the belt was made during one of those intense war room meetings, where a bunch of UFC big shots were sitting together, and it hit them like a lightning bolt. This Poirier and Gaethje matchup was just too awesome to ignore, and they needed something extra special to spice it up. Dana said all those fighters out there are craving the chance to fight for that BMF title because it's a golden ticket to glory, and they all want to be a part of that madness. An experience being called the baddest in the octagon. It's a whole different vibe, and when asked if the BMF belt would become a regular thing in the UFC, Dana said, "Everyone wants a shot at that belt, so why not?" So, from bringing the BMF title back because the UFC 291 matchup is way too iconic, to the last BMF title being a one-time thing back in 2019, this was the real reason Dana White is bringing back the BMF belt for Poirier versus Gaethje too.